Hi, it's Kirby Summers. It is January 21st. It is Tuesday, and it is freezing in New York City. It's about 12 degrees at this moment in time. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is a very large excerpt from my series, Deconstructing Wexner, which is on Substack. So if those of you who have recently joined my Substack have not dug into that series, you really should. It's got a lot of never, in fact, most of it has never been discussed by anyone, and certainly not in depth. So there you will find information on a Wexner relative, for example, who in fact was arrested. And you'll find a lot of the information that, of course, his wonderful public relations department, which is connected to the intelligence apparatus of this country, has made sure that never really reaches our eyes, okay? And the reason that I decided to do this today is because we have been talking about Sean Diddy Combs, and I have been trying to explain to you how Clive Davis, who in fact is now being criticized for wanting the quote party to go on. You know, he has an annual pre-Grammy party in Los Angeles. And honestly, with the fires raging, it doesn't surprise me because to me, Clive Davis is sort of the manifestation of the DEVIL himself. So the fact that he wants a party while California goes up in flames is not surprising to me. And I think I said in my test for my live stream, I will be going on Sean Atwood's show within the next week or so. We're changing the schedule of, I was supposed to do it Wednesday, the 22nd, but there's some conflict with schedules going back and forth. And so I will let you know on X when we have decided to sit down, at which point I'm going to be going in depth into the intelligence connections as it pertains to Davis and Sean Combs and all of that. And it's going to be a deep dive that really will include names that you are familiar with, but that you never thought were connected. So today, before I get started, I want to thank Sandra Y for the super thanks. I want to thank Daniel N. I want to thank Mike B and Laura E. I want to thank you guys for taking the time of trudging on over to my website where you made a one-time contribution, which helps me keep at least 90% versus the 50% that I get on this platform. I want to thank those of you again who take the time to like and to subscribe. So uh, we're going to cover, and you really should stay tuned until the very end of this podcast. It's going to be very detailed. I haven't shared this information on this platform before. This is only available on my Substack, so I am making an exception today because there are a lot of gaping holes in the history of some of the people that I will be discussing with you. And again, these are some names you are familiar with perhaps some of the connections you may not be familiar with. And so pretty much we're going to learn how Wexy became involved with the Rothschilds, how the Vicki Morgan and Blooomingdale situation and the blackmail tapes and what that was really about, because I believe the public only has a sliver of that story. I want to discuss things about Roy Cohn who that have not been discussed before. So, for example, there is a connection to the son of Sam, and there's a connection clearly to the Process Church. And that has not been discussed. And also, then how does the Vatican fit into this? So this is a really deep dive. And I'm doing this really in a way to thank those of you who have stepped up your game to subscribe, to leave interesting comments that then lead to further research, because this is a collaborative effort. So anyway, I'm going to begin here. Tracing Wexie's family history takes us back through time and connects to some of our more well-known and intelligence-based scandals. Alfred Bloomingdale and Vicki Morgan as one example. The press only reported what the three-letter agency allowed it to write. Even Operation Mockingbird has been improperly defined by the very media intelligence controls, so that I am going to have to probably use either spelling and or an alternative word. As you all know, we have been having to do this for a while on this platform, and most of you are wonderful. You understand what I'm saying, and you're with me. And those of you who have trouble, then just listen to it again. It's pretty concise, and it makes sense if you just listen to the sentence and how I explain and or spell. So I cannot do anything other than that, because we really, freedom of speech is sort of just a myth, let's say. In any event, I'm going to continue with my work here. If you're a student of espionage, and here I know that almost everyone is, you'll know that the three-letter agency was created to protect the banking and business interests, both abroad and within the United States, but not necessarily to protect the citizens. So, and then what about MOSSAD? And then within the series of my Deconstructing Wexner, I also go into that. And so Wexie's parents were, I believe, his grandparents. Exactly. So we're back in his grandparents. And frankly, I began with Wexie, and this is a little bit after, but I began with Wexie when his family was still in Russia. And I can tell you this, that in Russia, at the age of 12, 13, some of the Wexie family members were already thieves. Yeah, thieves. And once they arrived in the United States, one or two of these were caught, and they were placed in jail. So we do have family members. If you read Deconstructing Wexner, you will see that some family members of the Wexie family have been incarcerated. So Abraham and Malka Wexner, those are his grandparents. And so they met Herschel and Leah Kabakov, who are the parents of Wexie's mother, Bella. And they met each other in Ohio. Now that you know the people I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to continue reading this particular installment. Unlike Abraham and Malka Wexner's unruly brood of illiterate children, Herschel and Leah Kabakov knew the importance of education. They settled into the ever-expanding close-knit circle of Russian immigrants on the south side of Columbus, Ohio, where their youngest and fifth child, Isidore, was born in 1912, and off to school they went. With the help of Joseph Schoenthal, and you will know who this person is. He is, frankly, a Mason, and he is friends with many presidents, and he is the most powerful person in Ohio when the Wexie family settles there. And through this person, it is how Wexie's mother becomes connected to the other Masons. And frankly, they were members of more than one secret society. There are many secret societies that the upper crust, like Joseph Schoenthal, were connected to. That said, they were also connected to children's issues. Yes. So I'm not going to go into that here, but again, on my Substack, you can read all of the bits and pieces that I was able to find with a lot of trouble, frankly. So, Herschel resurrected his furniture making business. And by the way, he had been a person who made furniture in Russia and therefore was able to support his family because he made furniture for the Tsar of Russia. That's right. He was connected to the Tsar of Russia. In fact, the Tsar that was brutally murdered. I should have used another word, but hey, I'll just keep going. So with the help of this man, Joseph Chantal, Herschel did resurrect his furniture making business. He purchased a Ford Model T truck, and once his eldest son, Morris, Americanized to Maurice, born 1909 through 1999, became a teenager, he enlisted his help as assistant and driver. Bella, now she's a young girl, attended South High School, a public school, which required her to take the Parsons Avenue streetcar, although she would not graduate, unlike her brothers, Morris and Isidore, who continued their education at Ohio State University and became physicians. Morris, who had movie star good looks but never married, chose podiatry. Isidore selected dentistry. Ida, the eldest, never married due to a childhood injury which left her physically impaired, and she stayed home. And then Rebecca, the second born, became a housewife. And I in the article I include a photograph of the high school that Bella attended. Wexie's mother at the time of her attendance, and you see a couple of model Fords on the street, pretty empty streets because not everybody was able to afford a car. I show a photograph of the type of bus that she took. I show photographs of many, many things that I can't show here because I don't know how to do that yet. Bella came of age during the Roaring Twenties, a period of prosperity after World War I and after the 19th Amendment, 1920, which gave women the right to vote. Department stores grew during this time, and they needed female employees to sell the latest fashion. While in high school, she was introduced to a close associate of Joseph Chantal by the name of Fred Lazarus Jr., born 1884 to 1973, owner of the Lazarus department store where she was hired and trained in the garment industry. And then I show a photo of the man who hired her. And now this is where her life intersects with the ruling elite families, such as the Rothschilds, the Strausses, who owned Macy's, the Guggenheims, and even the Bloomingdale dynasty. The rag trade, as it is generally referred to, was already in bed with organized crime. So before famous mafiosos such as Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and Meyer Lansky, there was Giuseppe Morello, 1867 to 1930, a one-fingered madman who, along with his murderous gang of brothers, began the American Mafia. Giuseppe, nicknamed the Clutch Hand Morello, also known as the Old Fox, was the first boss of the Morello crime family. They morphed into the Genovese family, the oldest and largest of the five families known as La Cosa Nostra or simply the Mafia. When they speak about themselves, they call themselves La Cosa Nostra. When we, I guess as Americans and or as, you're in another country, you call them the mafia, but inside they do call themselves La Cosa Nostra. From their earliest days in the United States, they made money from extortion, trucking, and prostitution. And that includes all ages. I'm not, so that includes what we discuss. So I did flash forward and I basically included an excerpt showing Edward DeBartolo, who is, quote, a real estate developer from Youngstown, Ohio, and his connection with R. Wexy of the Limited in Columbus. And the fact that they have a well-known history of business and investment partnerships. I also show Francis J. Frank Walsh is the owner and chief executive of the Walsh Trucking Company out of New Jersey, and that the Walsh Trucking Company is and has been the primary transporter for the Limited in Columbus, and that in July of 1984, Walsh was being investigated by the New York Organized Crime Task Force with sending notices to them for being investigated for racketeering at Wexy's Ohio address for the Limited in Columbus, Ohio. Okay. So both Dean Bartolo and Walsh have been identified as associates of the Genovese La Rocca crime family in Pittsburgh, now called simply the Pittsburgh family. So it can be determined, this excerpt that I copied from a report, an earlier report, determined that Wexy, through the Limited, is in fact associated with at least two organized crime figures who are then associated in turn with the Pittsburgh crime family. So I'm going to go back to my article, because I'm trying to share with you the excerpts that I included to sort of put things into context, photographs, and then, what I discovered further, in addition to the stuff that I pulled up. So the Genoveses would also become Wexy's silent partners in the Limited, which was created only because of his mother's long ties to the criminal underworld. So that is the beginning. And then I show a photograph from the Ohio Historical Society showing an old Lazarus owned department store, which was the very beginning of this family's entrance into the garment industry and into having building up stores. Lazarus was a multi-generational Freemason. One of his forebearers belonged to the same lodge as George Washington. He is also the grandson of Simon Lazarus, 1807, 1877, founder of the original Lazarus store. And so I go a little bit into him because it's important to know everybody that has a role in this family. And that's really the only way to get to the bottom of things here. So Simon Lazarus, 1807 to 1877, was trained in Germany as a rabbi, but was never ordained. So that's very similar to Leon Black's father, Eli, who was also trained as a rabbi, but he never became ordained, and in fact took another course, right? He took a left turn into the business/intelligence field, and that's exactly what Simon Lazarus did. He married twice with little known. There's very little about his first wife, frankly, and or even the first set of children. At the age of 43, in 1850, he left Germany with his second wife, a much younger woman by the name of Amelia, her son David, and their infant son Fred, and headed to Franklin County, Ohio, named after Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the United States. In 1851, he opened as Lazarus on the ground floor of a small two-story building. The store, only 800 square feet, occupied the first floor. The second floor was used to hold services for the temple, of which he was a member. 1 year later, in 1852, another son, Fred, was born. The couple would add 4 daughters to the family. Simon was said to have been a very aggressive but quiet man. In 1865, after the end of the Civil War, soldiers began staggering back into town. Not only was Ulysses S. Grant born in Ohio, but the state sent more soldiers to fight the war than any other. 60% of Ohio men from ages 18 to 45 enlisted. More than 10% of these died. Sensing a business opportunity, Simon took a horse and buggy from Columbus, Ohio, to Rochester, New York, and brought back 200 ready-made suits. Up until that time, suits were made by tailors. Simon was the first to sell off-the-rack suits to the public. After his death, in 1877, the store, now bigger than ever and known as Lazarus and Sons, was renamed F&R Lazarus and Company, the initials of his 2 sons, Fred and Ralph. Fred Jr., like his father and uncle before him, grew up working at the store. And by age 10, he was already selling goods to customers. He had the gift of gab. He was friendly. He was sociable. He liked being among people. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but he dropped out almost immediately at the age of 18. And he did show himself to be a good businessman and knew that continued expansion was the way of the future. So in August of 1929, just 3 months before the Wall Street crash and the beginning of the Great Depression, Fred had a fateful meeting with Walter Rothschild, the owner of Abraham and Straus in Brooklyn, New York, and the never-married Edward Filene of Filene's department store in Boston. And then, of course, I show photographs of the old Abraham and Straus, with the horse-drawn carriage. In the first store in Brooklyn, I show a photograph of the old Filene's department store. Really fascinating historical photos. So on a sunny afternoon, the 3 men sat on Rothschild's yacht on the calm blue waters of Long Island Sound, where Rothschild had a summer home. They agreed to merge their respective family businesses, so Macy's and Bloomingdale's. So then I show a photograph of Lyman Bloomingdale, his brother Edward B. Bloomingdale, and I show a photograph of the very first store, very small and narrow, at 938 3rd Avenue. So just 7 months later, in February of 1930, they partnered up with Bloomingdale's of New York. The store had been founded in 1872 by Lyman Gustav Bloomingdale, 1841 through 1905, and his brother, Joseph Bernard Bloomingdale, 1842 to 1904. Each of the 4 department stores changed a majority of their stock for the newly created federated shares. It is this merger that helps them remain in business throughout the Great Depression. Of note, Alfred Bloomingdale, born 1916 through 1982, is Lyman's grandson. He is best remembered for his kinky S&M relationship and unalived slave Vicki Morgan, who was born in 1952 and who saw her last day in 1983. And then, of course, I include a photo of Vicki and Alfred. Bloomingdale maintained homes in New York, the Homely Hills section of Los Angeles, and he also had an apartment at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Briefly, it should be noted, because nobody else appears to be able to connect these dots, that the ownership of the Watergate building complex, and you will remember that Watergate was also the name of the big scandal that led to the Richard Nixon sort of resigning from office and all of that. Well, that leads us to the Vatican and Rome, and to the 1982 scandalous collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, because they owned the Watergate complex. Now, at the center of the bank's failure was Roberto Calvi. And I show a photo of Calvi, in his final moments before he was taken away into the morgue, who was a member of the Masonic Lodge Propaganda Dei, known as P2. So this bank was known as the Vatican's bank, and it was accused of covertly funneling money to the Nicaraguan Contras, yes, Reagan's Contras, of the Iran-Contra scandal, which was conducted with the help of Israel's Mossad. It was Israel that became the conduit for arms transfers. Calvi, known as God's banker, was found dangling off the scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London on June 17, 1982. So now we have a couple of unalivements, we have a couple of scandals, we have some dirty dealings in the background, we have shady people that I'm explaining to you. I'm shedding light on their lives and their history and who they are. Now, P2 was set up as a shadow government for Italy along fascist lines in the 1960s and the 1970s. It included 4 cabinet members, all 3 heads of Italy's intelligence organizations, 48 members of parliament, hundreds of military officers, and the most prominent industrialists, bankers, and diplomats. In addition, P2 had high-level contacts with Alexander Haig, Henry Kissinger, and the 3-letter agency in the United States that begins with the letter C. Ronald Reagan secured his first term as governor of California in 1966 with the financial help of Alfred Bloomingdale. Among his staffers was Edwin Meese, whom Reagan would take into the White House. Bloomingdale had an insatiable appetite, and in 1970, at the age of 54, met Vicki, who was then 18. She was married, and she was already a mother. He pursued her relentlessly, calling her as many as 20 times every day, and even buying off her husband, at which point, not realizing what lay in store for her, she caved into his demands. When Reagan became president of the United States, Bloomingdale, because he had funded him, right, became part of his kitchen cabinet. And what that is the unofficial group of political advisors. He is alleged to have secretly videotaped Reagan, Meese, who was the National Security Council from 1981 to 1985, and who also served as the 75th Attorney General from 1985 to 1988, and other prominent officials having S&MS with Vicki and other paid S workers, as is alleged in the Sean Combs case. None of this is new. This is standard operating procedure, I just want to say. I then included a very old article I was able to dig up on the Bloomingdale affair before he was unalived, and I show a photograph of Edwin Meese alongside Ronald Reagan, wearing the god-awful brown suits that I just don't know who can even wear. But anyway, I'm going to move on away from the photograph. In 1984, during Vicki's unalivement trial, the attorney for the defense, Marvin Pancoast, tried to subpoena Meese as a witness, but had a hard time finding him. Attorney Charles Matthews told reporters who were anxiously awaiting to hear about the raunchy tapes, We're having trouble finding him, referring, of course, to Mies. I haven't seen much of him recently. Have you? In 1981, the first year of Reagan's administration, he named Bloomingdale to the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and to the Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. Now, what does that tell you about Bloomingdale? Bloomingdale was a covert intelligence officer. Why nobody else has talked about the fact that he was, in fact, a covert asset, not unlike Epi, is beyond me, because it's not difficult to decipher his role. However, a year later, Bloomingdale was diagnosed as having cancer and learned that he would only have a few months left to live. So fast-acting cancer. Okay, so clearly, from where I sit and from what I've been able to study during the many years I've put into all of these different, seemingly different cases, but they're all connected, is that one of the ways you get rid of somebody that perhaps has too much information or could be a problem is that if you cannot discredit them, and you can't really discredit Bloomingdale, right? I mean, what are you going to say, that he cheated on his wife? Well, then, and you can't really come out and like unalive them, because this is a very powerful name, Bloomingdale. Well, then you have a couple of other options. You make them ill. You make them ill with something like cancer, or they have an accident, falling with, being in an airplane, or having a heart attack. In this case, they decided to give Bloomingdale uh, a fast-acting cancer. So, of course, he was a man who knew too much, and he had to be basically said bye-bye to. As he lay unaliving in a hospital, his wife, Betsy, learned of the monthly $10,000 payments he made to Vicki, with letters, handwritten letters, promising future financial support. Furious, Betsy stopped all payments to Vicki. Vicki, in turn, retaliated by hiring famed California palimony attorney Marvin Mitchelson and filing a breach of contract lawsuit against Bloomingdale on July 8 in the amount of $5 million. At the time, $5 million was considered a lot. You can use the normal 6 times ratio. So 6 times 5 would be 6, whatever that is, right? And so typically that would be the normal ratio. I think at this point it may be 7. On August 23rd, 1982, Alfred he expired, let's say, leaving behind a trail of blackmail tapes, murder, and possible conspiracies. Less than 11 months later, on July 7th, July 7th is an interesting date. In 1983, as Vicki lay asleep in her bed, she too, and I'll tell you what happened. I always found that to be an interesting date because it's like very close to the 4th of July, right? Um, the sort of the founding of America, the, you know, all of the founding father stuff that happens, 4th of July. I saw it as, um, a really sort of a selected date. However, as she lay asleep in her bed, Pancoast, who had become her roommate, Marvin Pancoast, got a baseball bat and hit her with it. I can't read exactly how I wrote this, so I just have to describe it to you. Hit her with it many, many times. And of course, she could not breathe any longer, and she was gone. However, he walked into the police station with not a speck of blood on his clothing, confessing to her unalivement. Later, he said he couldn't remember anything. And during the trial, he could not remember anything, and he pled not guilty. Doesn't that remind you of Sirhan? So what we have here, again, is a possible MK Ultra person who did this while under MK Ultra hypnosis. Okay, that is the way I see it. So Panko's attorneys believed he was the victim of a conspiracy and that he had been hypnotized into believing that he had indeed unalived her. They presented the theory that unknown persons were the culprits with the motive of suppressing videotapes, which allegedly showed her having not only with Bloomingdale, but other high-ranking officials. Political dirty trickster, P person, and S blackmailer Roy Cohn was Nancy Reagan's attorney. So Nancy Reagan, as you know, was Ronald Reagan's wife. She was also on Cohn's frequent caller list. Now, this is really interesting. He used to have people that he spoke to on a regular basis. And Nancy Reagan was one of those people. I show a photo of him in Ronald Reagan's office, and I also show some personal documents that belonged to Roy Cohn before he succumbed to AIDS and was no longer around. Now, the notes were taken by Cohn's assistant, Christine Seymour. Now, Christine worked for Cohn as the switchboard operator, connecting calls from mobsters like Carlo Gambino, who inspired the character Vito Corleone in The Godfather, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, the boss of the Genovese crime family, Nancy, Ronald Reagan's wife, and others. Cohn's longtime secretary, Susan Bell, said she listened in to all of them. Not at his direction, but he knew that she was listening into his calls, and Roy Cohn did not tell her not to. So according to Seymour's notes, Cohn's frequent phone pals included Nancy and the former three-letter agency director, William Casey, who was a director from 1981 to 1987 during the Reagan administration, who called Roy almost daily during Reagan's first term in office. Casey was also very close with Lawrence Larry King of the Franklin situation that we all know about on my channel, and his partner, CIA operative Craig Spence. And then, of course, I included the very now well-known Washington Times article dated June 29th, 1989, showing that, there's an inquiry ensnaring VIPs Reagan and Bush, where the so-called Hall Boys took midnight tours of the White House. So after this happened, Spence was found unalived in a hotel room on November 10th, 1989, in what was described as a self-unalivement. I do not believe he was self-unalived. The door was closed, but the door has been closed in other cases where there has been the, let's say, courtesy of your friendly three-letter agency. We were here, but we left no signs to let anyone think that we were here. Okay, that's really, I think, what happened. Seymour began working on a book based on the many conversations she'd overheard. On October 20th, 1994, after securing a book deal, she was driving her blue two-door Yugo on a highway in Florida when a tractor trailer collided into her car, instantly unaliving her. The Cohn connection suggests that Bloomingdale's S tapes were probably just a small part of what appears to be an ongoing intel-connected blackmail operation, one that began long before Cohn was even born. Okay, so we have now a continuation. We see it in the Sean Diddy Combs case. We see it with the Clive Davis before him I believe I made some reference to the fact that he too was involved in something similar, and I will be expanding on that perhaps during my conversation with Sean on his channel in a few days, less than a week, I'm sure. In any event, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Please take a moment to like this podcast. And if you have not subscribed, do so now. And again, if you want to read the entire series, and there's so much information that I gather because I do go into the nooks and crannies where people really don't go, and I connect things that for some reason they don't appear in books that typically cover these subjects. So, I clearly invite you to come over to my Substack where there's tons of information. And there are now, I believe, well over 250 essays/articles that I've uploaded. And I'm in the middle of doing additional work on the series that I started, Weird Scenes in Liverpool, that revolve around the Beatles and some of the people that I just discussed here. Okay, guys, well, I hope you all have a really good day and that you stay warm. I don't know where you are, but it's really cold today. And you have a good day. Bye.